Hello everybody, it's your boy Apollo, and today it's all about reviewing. Reviewing what, you may ask? Why, it's the 1937 classic Disney movie, Snow White. The first major animation feature film so inventive, they had to make a new award just to recognize how good it was. Now, I've chosen to do Disney films because, you may not know this, I'm a gamer second, but a Disney nerd first. The parks are my usual forte, but the films are there to tide you over in between visits, as well as providing that all-important Disney mythos. Snow White is a difficult film to place in public consciousness. I've only ever seen it twice in my lifetime, probably more that I don't remember, and I'm a Disney fanatic. So I wonder, what does that say about the rest of the population? I wager that many young people haven't seen or simply forgotten the film, with older members of the audience also forgetting the fine details of the film. I mean, everybody knows the story, but I doubt many have seen the film in the past, 5 years or so. The characters are about the only thing to have survived over the years. Snow White, of course, the evil queen, the prince, the seven dwarfs, etc. I would argue the dwarves have been the longest lasting element of the films due to the amount of merchandise they get featured on, especially Grumpy, who seems to do exceptionally well. All that aside, however, the tale of Snow White has endured firstly through the written story and now the animated. It's a crowning achievement of cinema and one of Walt Disney's largest achievements. Of course, everyone remembers the Oscar he received, a regular-sized Oscar award and 7 little ones presented by none other than Shirley Temple. The film today is impressive, but within the context of the 1930s, it would have been awe-inspiring considering how much of a revolution this was. Computer-aided graphics and 3D modeling were a long way off, so hand-drawn animation was used, which makes the films all the more impressive and beautiful. Now, you may be asking, why am I saying all these nice things? Is it because the film isn't that great? That depends on your perspective. In my eyes, the 1930s are over, so any attempt at appreciating the film at its peak is entirely lost, so the only way to critique it is to treat it like any other film. I mean, the film used colour, something we take for granted nowadays, but wasn't commonplace until the 40s and 50s. I'll quickly go over the plot, but I should probably watch the film first, so I'll be back in just a second.
2 hours later.
Okay, now we've gotten that out of the way. Snow White is the most beautiful woman throughout the land, and her evil stepmother, the Queen, however, wants to keep her down, so she dresses her in rags and makes her a maid. During the first scene, the prince notices her singing, and the two of them do this whole Romeo and Juliet thing while the queen watches. The queen commands a huntsman to assassinate Snow White, but when the time approaches, he doesn't go through with it. Snow White runs into the dark forest and ends up in the Seven Dwarfs' cottage, where she cleans the place and then falls asleep. The dwarves return home to wake Snow White, and the scene ends in celebration. The following day, the dwarves go to work, and Snow White is approached by the Queen in disguise. Snow White eats the poison apple, and the Queen is pursued by the dwarves until her death. Snow White is buried in a glass coffin until the prince gives her the old true love's first kiss, and they ride off into the sunset together. And I'm not making that last bit up. They do, in fact, ride off into the sunset together. So I think it's important to look at a few major criticisms of the film. First of all, the pacing really isn't that good. The film opens strong with a lot of things happening very quickly, but the scenes inside the dwarves' cottage make up most of the film and arguably detract from the pace. Now, I reckon this was probably done to create more opportunities for interesting animations without the need to create more painted scenes, which makes more sense. However, some scenes do drag on too long, such as the scene where the dwarves look around their cottage for the intruder. Also, the villain is killed in probably the most unremarkable way possible. She's struck by lightning and falls into an abyss. That doesn't seem very remarkable to me, but what do I know? There's also a lot of plot points that are pretty absurd. Now, I know this is based on the fairy tale, and, they're trying to keep to that particular story, but some of it is just ridiculous. The Queen demands proof of Snow White's death, and demands her heart as that proof, but despite her omniscience, especially with that damned mirror, can't tell that it's a pig's heart rather than a human heart. Also, Snow White, despite knowing that she's marked for death, takes a bite from an apple given to her by a stranger, which even the goddamn animals know is no good. Also, the Queen's plan makes no sense as she has to sabotage her own beauty to kill the most beautiful person. Like, I don't even know if she has a game plan to return to normal after this is over. And I find it extremely convenient that the dwarves just don't have it in them to bury Snow White. And speaking of which, the film is very dark. I know people these days have it in their heads that Disney sanitized the fairy tales, but not to the extent that the film is free from horrific elements. After the huntsman fails, which if you think about it is already attempted murder, the plan of the Queen is to prepare a poison called Sleeping Death, the effects of which cause the breath to still and the blood to congeal, after which the idea is that the dwarves will bury Snow White thinking she's dead, so she will in effect be buried alive. To be fair, some of the darker elements are used to great effect, such as with the scary forest scene, which alludes to the fact that Snow White is extremely paranoid after being told she's the target of her stepmother. The fact that the trees and floating logs become terrifying monsters supports the idea it's all just in her head, which I think is really quite clever. The film is also fairly good with the symbolism, though it doesn't reach the height of Disney's later work. The vultures that loom in the third act seem like they're following the witch as the spectre of death, but then you realise at the end they actually represent the death of the witch instead. The film also uses a somewhat worn trope of the hero or heroine being connected to nature, as seen through the way she interacts with the animals, but also seen through her nemesis the Queen, whose domain is devoid of life, besides one Raven, who is thoroughly frightened of her. I also really like the idea that once the Queen does take the peddler's potion, it's actually a reveal rather than a disguise, showing the audience the physical manifestation of her corruption. I should also talk about the soundtrack, which once again is good, but not great. You all know the famous songs like Whistle While You Work, Hi Ho, and Someday My Prince Will Come, but there's some lesser known ones to enjoy like I'm Wishing, the Dwarfs Yodel song, and my personal favourite, One Song, which is sung by the Prince. Overall, there's not much variety, and it all kind of sounds the same, especially Snow White's 3 songs. Also, due to the poor audio recording used at the time, it's kind of difficult sometimes to work out what is actually being sung, but once again there's a strong attempt, with a lot of room for improvement. But if there's one thing I do have to praise, it is the animation, and oh boy, the animation is really, really good. You can tell this film took ages to make because even when the story doesn't quite live up to the expectations of the audience, the animation really helps to take on the burden. All the characters are extremely expressive, which honestly makes some of the dialogue in this film redundant. Snow White is obviously always charming and has the most effort of all the characters put into her. The Queen is stoic and stiff, while her witch counterpart is creepy and unsettling. The dwarves all have personalities based on their names, so I bet that was an easy one. You know, how should we animate this one? Well, what's his name? Grumpy. Oh, I don't know, make him grumpy all the time? Ah, that's genius. I'll admit, however, that the character of the prince is done pretty dirty. He turns up, has one song, then awakens Snow White at the end. He doesn't even have to fight a monster or anything, which makes his happily ever after feel rather unjustified, and thus the film seems to set tropes that will dominate Disney for years to come, like the trope that the princess can talk to animals, or that the prince is basically just there to save the princess, and that the princess is usually the target of another family member. Rinse and repeat. Yeah, I can't shake this feeling that the film would be effectively made twice over with varying degrees of success. But enough of that, how do I actually rate the film? Well, it's tricky, because I really doubt modern audiences will have the patience, even though it's only 83 minutes long. I think people are happy to accept its cultural significance and to move on, and I feel like anything positive I have to say will be prefaced with despite the, or considering. So I'd say watch it if you haven't, or don't really remember how it goes. But I do want to reiterate that the animation in this film is impeccable, and unfortunately the process used to make this film is basically a lost art because of how labour intensive it is. I mean, the techniques used to make the film are borderline black magic. Saying that aside though, I don't even know what the theme or moral is to the film other than it's wrong to be a tyrannical person who hires assassins. The film's aim is to be aesthetically pleasing simply for its own sake, well, at least that's the impression as I get, but as we'll see in later films, especially during the Renaissance era, that the themes can be intriguing despite these films ultimately being made for children. Which I'd argue isn't really true anyways, because these films are for the young and the young at heart. Now, I could give a score out of 10, but I think everyone knows that's fairly meaningless, so what I'm going to do instead is pretend I'm a friend recommending certain films, then I'm going to place them to the left and right to indicate how much I think you should watch the film. So, as I've done only one, which is Snow White, it is effectively the benchmark, and everything else I review will be judged by what's to come before it, so hopefully it'll provide a little more information when it comes to understanding which films are worthwhile and which ones are not. Now obviously when we get to the late 90s and early 2000s, especially with the rise of Pixar films, you're going to get a heavy dose of bias, but hopefully I'll make people aware of it as to explain the inflated results. But we've got a long way to go before that, so strap in and I'll see how this goes. Thank you all very much for taking the time out of your day to watch this. Take care and goodbye.